The booth is 4 feet wide, 4 feet of bulletproof glass, a small counter, a screen, a stamp, and a question that will determine whether someone's life continues the way they planned or doesn't. You're a Customs and Border Protection officer at a United States port of entry, and everything that happens in this country begins legally with you. Every tourist, every returning citizen, every nervous student clutching an E20, every diplomat who thinks the rules are decorative, every truck hauling freight from Laredo to Louisville, every family reunion, every smuggling attempt, every asylum claim whispered through tears at 3 a.m. All of it passes through a booth roughly the size of a closet. You didn't start here. You started at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glynco, Georgia. 19 weeks of immigration law, customs enforcement, firearms qualification, Spanish language instruction, and a curriculum designed to turn you into someone who can read, a passport, a face, and a lie in under 90 seconds. They taught you the Immigration and Nationality Act. They taught you Title 19. They taught you how to identify a fraudulent visa foil under UV light, and how to spot behavioural indicators that a traveller's story doesn't match their documents. What they couldn't teach you is what 90 seconds actually feels like when the line behind the person in front of you stretches 200 deep. Your supervisor is watching throughput numbers on a live dashboard, and the traveller you're speaking to just handed you a passport with a name that doesn't match the ticket they booked. You are GS5 when you start, maybe GS7 if you had the education. You are one of over 60,000 employees in the largest federal law enforcement agency in the United States, CBP, and your job title sounds powerful until you realise the booth doesn't have air conditioning that works consistently, and your lunch break depends entirely on whether the flight from Bogota landed on time. The uniform is dark blue, the badge is real, the authority is enormous, and almost immediately you learn that enormous authority without enough time to use it carefully is one of the most dangerous combinations the federal government has ever designed. You process travellers. That's the official language. What it actually means is that you are making a legal determination of admissibility, right there, standing up, under fluorescent light, while someone's child is crying and your earpiece is relaying a TECS hit from a database you need to check before you say another word. Welcome to the port. Try not to let the line back up. Bun, primary. They call your station primary inspection. It sounds clinical, it is clinical, and it is also the single most consequential 60 to 90 second interaction most people will ever have with the United States government. Here's what happens. A traveller approaches. You take the passport, you scan it. The system pulls records, TECS, NCIC, ATS, sometimes Interpol. You glance at the photo, you glance at the face, you ask questions. Where are you coming from? What's the purpose of your visit? How long are you staying? Who are you visiting? What do you do for work? You're not making conversation. You're building a profile in real time, comparing what the system tells you to what the person tells you to what the documents tell you, and deciding in less time than it takes to order coffee whether this person enters the country or gets referred to secondary. Most people pass. The vast majority of travellers are exactly who they say they are, doing exactly what they claim. Your job is to find the ones who aren't, and to do it without slowing the line to a point where your port director gets a call from an airline executive. Throughput. That word will follow you for years. CBP tracks how many travellers you process per hour. Too slow and you're a bottleneck. Too fast and you're not being thorough. The ideal officer, according to the metrics, is someone who processes travellers quickly, catches anomalies reliably, and never causes a scene. In other words, they want a human algorithm that also has good judgment and doesn't need bathroom breaks. You learn to read documents the way a mechanic reads engine sounds. A passport that's been washed, a visa page with slightly wrong font spacing, an arrival card filled out in handwriting that doesn't match the traveller's claimed education level, a stamp from a country the traveller says they've never visited. You're looking for inconsistencies, not because everyone is lying, but because the ones who are lying have usually rehearsed their story well enough that only the paper gives them away. And then there are the ones who aren't lying at all, they're just scared. A legal permanent resident who hasn't been back in 3 years and is terrified you'll question their residency. A student whose visa is valid but whose enrollment status changed. A mother travelling with a child whose last name is different from hers. None of them are doing anything wrong, and all of them are looking at you the way people look at someone who holds their future in a stamp. You learn something about yourself very quickly in primary. You learn whether pressure makes you sharper or whether it makes you cut corners. There's no middle ground in the booth. You're either reading the situation or you're processing paper, and the agency, quietly, is watching which one you become. The line never ends. The next passport is already sliding toward you. 2. Secondary. Secondary inspection is where the booth ends and the room begins. When you refer someone from primary, they don't get told much. They get directed to a separate area, a room with chairs, a counter, more officers, and a very different energy. In primary, the interaction is brief and transactional. In secondary, it slows down, and when things slow down at a port of entry, they rarely slow down in the traveller's favour. This is where you dig, you pull up the full record, you examine the documents more carefully, you ask longer questions, you cross-reference, you may search luggage, you may check a phone. Depending on the circumstances and whether your supervisory chain has determined reasonable suspicion exists, you have broad authority at the border, broader than most people realise. The Fourth Amendment, as it applies at ports of entry, operates under the border search exception, which means you can conduct routine searches without a warrant and without probable cause. Non-routine searches, body searches, extended device forensics, require more. But more at the border is still less than what a police officer would need on a city street in Kansas. You learn this power early. You learn its weight even earlier. In secondary, you meet the cases that don't fit neatly into admit or refuse. The B1/B2 visitor who's clearly coming to work but swears they're here for tourism. The F1 student whose CV's record shows terminated status they didn't know about. The returning green card holder who's been abroad 14 months and can't explain why. The traveller with a prior removal order who is now presenting a brand new passport from a country that doesn't share records with the US efficiently. Each case is a small legal proceeding happening in a government room that smells like disinfectant and vending machine coffee. You are not a judge, but you are making determinations that a judge may never review because most travellers who are denied entry or given expedited removal orders don't have the right to a hearing in immigration court. Under Section 235(b)(1) of the INA, if you determine someone is inadmissible for fraud or misrepresentation, or for lacking proper documents, you can order expedited removal, and that person can be on a plane home within hours. That power is real, and it sits in the hands of someone who also had to park in a lot a half-mile from the terminal because the employee spaces were full again. You also meet asylum seekers in secondary, someone who tells you they're afraid to go home. Under the law, that triggers a credible fear process. You record the claim, you notify an asylum officer. The person is referred for a credible fear interview. You do not evaluate the claim yourself, but you're the first federal official to hear it, and how you handle that moment, whether you listen carefully or rush through it, shapes everything that comes next for that person. The room is never empty. There is always someone waiting, and the paperwork from each secondary case follows you long after the person has left. 3. The shift. Nobody talks about the hours until you're living inside them. CBP officers at ports of entry work rotating shifts. You might work days for a stretch, then swing to evenings, then nights. At a land port, your shift might start at 5 in the morning when the first commercial trucks begin queuing at the crossing. At an airport, you might draw the red-eye rotation, the flights from Sao Paulo, Lagos, Doha, Manila, arriving between midnight and 4 a.m., depositing hundreds of exhausted travellers into your inspection hall, while your own circadian rhythm quietly collapses. You adjust. Everyone adjusts. You drink coffee that tastes like it was brewed during a previous administration. You eat from vending machines strategically positioned to profit from the fact that your meal break got cut to 20 minutes because a flight from Delhi landed early and the hall is overflowing. The physical environment varies by port. If you're at JFK or LAX, you're inside a massive terminal with some semblance of infrastructure. If you're at a land port on the southern border, Nogales, El Paso, Brownsville, San Ysidro, you're standing in heat that makes the Kevlar under your uniform feel personal. San Ysidro processes over 70,000 northbound crossings a day. 70,000. Each one requiring a decision, each one tracked. The volume is not a statistic you read in a report. It's a physical pressure you feel in your legs, your lower back, and the part of your brain that processes faces. And the faces begin to merge. That's the part no one warns you about. Somewhere around year 2 or 3, you start to realize that the human ability to stay alert, case after case, hour after hour, shift after shift, has a ceiling. You trained for vigilance, you were tested on it. But vigilance at scale, sustained over years, is not a skill. It's an endurance sport disguised as a desk job. Overtime is not optional in any meaningful sense. CBP has been understaffed for years. Congress authorizes hiring surges. The surges underperform because recruitment, background checks, polygraphs and training pipelines are slow, and attrition keeps eating the gains. So you work overtime, you work holidays, you work the 4th of July inside a booth while the country you're protecting sets off fireworks you can hear but can't see. Your GS level moves. You go from GS7 to GS9 to GS11 to GS12 on a career ladder if things go well. At GS12, your base pay looks reasonable on paper, somewhere around 80 to 90,000. But the locality adjustment and overtime push it higher, and you realise the money is better than you expected. You also realise the money has to be better than you expected, because otherwise, no one would stay. Some officers rotate into specialised units: K9, anti-terrorism, trade enforcement, outbound operations. Some test for supervisory positions. Some apply to transfer to the Office of Field Operations Headquarters. Some quietly start studying for other federal jobs, HSI, Secret Service, DEA, because the booth, over time, starts to feel like a place you were supposed to pass through, not live inside. But many stay, and the ones who stay develop something you can only describe as institutional gravity, a pull that keeps you in the system not because you love it, but because you've built a life around its schedule, its pension, its certainty, and its strange, exhausting predictability. Your alarm goes off at 3:47 a.m. for the early shift. You put on the uniform, you drive to the port, you badge in, you take your position, the line is already forming. 4. The grey. You were trained in law, you were tested on procedure, but nobody gave you a manual for the grey. The grey is what lives between the clean categories: admissible, inadmissible, citizen, non-citizen, legal, illegal. The training presents these as binary. The port presents them as spectrum, a long, exhausting spectrum where every case sits slightly differently, and your judgment is the only thing standing between the textbook and the human being on the other side of the counter. A woman arrives on a B2 tourist visa. Her story checks out, her documents are clean, but she's carrying 2 suitcases, a printed list of apartment rentals in Queens, and a resume she forgot was in the front pocket of her bag. She says she's visiting family. Maybe she is. Maybe the resume is from a previous trip. Maybe she intends to overstay and work. You don't know. The law says you can deny entry if you believe the traveller's stated intent doesn't match the evidence. But believe is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, and the woman in front of you is 53 years old, she's tired, and she's looking at you the way people look at someone who's about to decide whether their month goes well or terribly. You make a call. You make dozens of these calls a day, and each one is technically a legal determination, but functionally it's a judgment call made under time pressure by a person who had 4 hours of sleep and hasn't eaten since a granola bar at 6 a.m. The grey also lives in enforcement priorities, policy changes, administration shifts. 1 year, the emphasis is on counterfeit goods. The next, it's fentanyl interdiction. The next, it's visa overstays. The statute doesn't change, but the operational focus does, and with it the unspoken understanding of which cases matter most to leadership and which ones you're expected to move through quickly. Nobody hands you a memo that says ease up on this or crack down on that. It's subtler than that. It comes through briefings, staffing allocations, which cases get supervisory attention and which ones don't. You learn to read institutional weather the way a sailor reads wind, not from what's announced, but from what shifts. And then there's discretion, the word they use carefully in training and even more carefully in practice. You have prosecutorial discretion. You can issue a warning instead of a formal finding. You can give a traveller the benefit of the doubt, or you can hold the line. Both are defensible, both are legal, and both produce completely different outcomes for the person standing in front of you. The officers who last a long time develop a kind of internal calibration, a sense for when the grey is genuinely ambiguous and when someone is exploiting it. But that calibration isn't science. It's pattern recognition built on experience, shaped by fatigue, influenced by mood, and occasionally wrong. You won't always get it right. The system doesn't expect perfection. It expects documentation. If you wrote it down, justified it, and followed procedure, the institution will stand behind you. If you didn't, the institution will find someone else to stand behind. 5. The weight. No one tells you what the badge does to your psychology over time. In your first year, you feel the authority. It's real and immediate and occasionally intoxicating. You say, "Step aside, please," and a person steps aside. You stamp a passport and a life continues. You flag a document and a life pauses. The power isn't abstract, it's mechanical. You pull the lever and the gate opens, or it doesn't. By year 5, the authority hasn't faded, but it's changed shape. It no longer feels like power. It feels like weight. Every decision you've made is still in the system. Every referral, every admission, every expedited removal. Your name is on those records, and somewhere in the back of your mind you start keeping a second ledger. Not the official one, but a private one. The woman you sent to secondary who turned out to be completely legitimate and missed her connecting flight. The young man you admitted who later showed up in an HSI investigation. The asylum seeker you, processed at 2 a.m, whose face you still remember, because they were shaking so hard they couldn't hold the pen. The agency offers employee assistance programs, counselling, peer support. The resources exist on paper and they're available if you ask. But the culture doesn't always make asking easy. You work in a law enforcement environment where composure is currency and vulnerability is a luxury most officers can't afford to display in front of colleagues who are dealing with the same volume, the same fatigue, and the same slow erosion of whatever emotional margin they started with. Burnout at CBP isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives as efficiency. You start processing faster, asking fewer questions, reading documents with less curiosity. You tell yourself you've gotten better at the job. Quicker, more experienced, more decisive, and maybe that's true. Or maybe you've just stopped looking as closely because looking closely every time at every case, for years, is something the human nervous system was never designed to do. Some officers harden, some officers transfer, some officers retire at 20 years with a pension and a set of memories they'll sort through for the rest of their lives, and some officers stay right where they are, in the booth, in the hall, on the shift, because the structure holds them together in a way that nothing outside the uniform quite replicates. You go home, you take off the badge, you sit in your kitchen and someone asks you how your day was. You say fine, because explaining what it actually feels like to spend 8 hours deciding who enters the country, one face at a time, one story at a time, one stamp at a time, is not a conversation that fits between dinner and the evening news. 6. The line. Here is what no one outside the port will ever fully understand. You are not the policy, you're not the politics, you're not the debate that plays out on cable news, or the argument that trends online every time the word border enters the national conversation. You're a federal employee standing in a booth, applying law as written, under conditions that were designed by people who have never worked a shift in your building. The public sees the border as a symbol. You see it as a Tuesday. Congress sets immigration law. The White House sets enforcement priorities. Courts issue rulings that change your operational procedures overnight. Advocacy groups file lawsuits. Media covers the spectacle. And you show up, badge in, and figure out what today's version of the rules actually means for the next person standing in front of you. You didn't write the Immigration and Nationality Act. You didn't design the visa system. You didn't create the backlog, the understaffing, the contradictions between statutes passed decades apart, or the political incentives that make comprehensive reform impossible every single election cycle. But you are the face of all of it. You are the person the traveller sees. You are the moment where American immigration policy stops being theoretical and becomes someone's actual Tuesday afternoon. And so you do the only thing the job allows. You read the document, you ask the question, you check the system, you make the call, you stamp the passport or you don't, and then you look up and the next person is already walking toward you, and they are holding their documents a little too tightly, and you can see in their eyes that they have been waiting for this moment for a very long time. You nod, you take the passport, you begin. So that's life on the other side of the booth, where national security is a 60-second conversation and lunch is a vending machine negotiation. Subscribe for more careers that sound powerful until you hear about the parking situation.